our collar pieces have been prepared, we can go ahead and finally start sewing them onto the bodice. I've laid out my bodice right here with the right side facing up. And I also have the two halves of my collar with the right side facing up, which in this case is the upper collar. We're just going to be placing each collar half on the neckline and pinning it in place. But first, you may have this little bit of an overhang of the seam allowance along the neckline on your collar halves. I'm just going to clip that off so that I have a nice even neckline shape. As we pin this in place, we have a few important matchup points. Right here, where the two halves of the collar are going to meet at the center front, we have to be very strategic about how we place these. You should have a center front notch on the neckline of your bodice. As we bring the collars inward and match them up there, you don't want to just match the 2 points right here because those are just the points of the seam allowance. And what will happen if you match those points is after we sew our collar and facing in place, the seam line for the facing will be down here, and it'll look like the two collars are not matching up perfectly at the center. There's going to be a gap between them, and we don't want that. So as you go to place these, you actually have to overlap the two corners of the collars so that the point at which they meet right here is 1/4 of an inch down from the actual edges of the fabric. That way, when we sew across this at 1/4 inch seam allowance, we will see them perfectly meeting at that neckline seam. So I want to give this little overlap and make sure also that the point that they're overlapping is right at the notch. And this is the point at which we will pin the center fronts of the collars. It's going to be too hard to pin right through the point that they overlap. It's just too thick. So I could do one pin off to either side, as long as they're held in that slightly overlapping position. After matching up this crucial point, you want to also be sure that you match up these notches on the collar to the shoulder seams on the bodice. So I'll look for the notch, match it to my shoulder seam, and pin. And then for the back portions of the collar, you should have notches on the neckline that are 3/8 of an inch inward from the center back seam. This notch is the point at which I want to match the finished end of my collar. Pin both sides at that same location. And once you have these key points pinned, then go ahead and add more pins in the spaces between, following the neckline shape. Once the collar has been thoroughly pinned in place, now we're going to go and stay stitch the collar. This isn't going to be our final seam. That will happen in the next stage when we apply the facing over everything. That final seam involving the facing will be sewn at 1/4 of an inch. So for this round of stitching, we're going to sew at the same 1/8 of an inch stay stitch position that we just did along the collar itself. We're doing this because we don't want this round of stitching to be peeking out of our final seam in the end, which is why we're sewing it at a little bit less than that 1/4 of an inch. So we'll just go all the way around the collar, and you can pretty much stitch on top of the pre-existing stay stitch line. Now that our collar is in place, we can go ahead and fully finish off our neckline by applying the facing as well. And if you've elected to not do the collar for this garment, you'll still be taking the facing now and applying it to the bodice in the same manner. You just won't have the collar sandwiched in between the way you see here. So I have my bodice with the collar laying right side facing up. Here's my facing, which is also right side up. I want to flip it over so that it's now right side down as I place it against the bodice. So just imagine bodice and facing, right sides together. And if you created the collar, it's sandwiched in between. I'll lay it right on top, and we're just going to be matching the neckline and pinning. But we want to start with all of our key points first. At the center back neck corners right here, you're going to be matching the corner of the facing to the corner of the bodice, not the collar, which is kind of backed off a little ways. So I'll match these two corners. Pin. Then we can match our center front notches and pin. And then for our final checkpoints, we want to match up our shoulder seams as well. After all of your checkpoints are pinned, then we just want to fill in the remaining sections with more pins. Once your neckline is thoroughly pinned, you're ready to sew, and we'll just be going all the way around the neckline with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be sure to check and adjust all of your layers of fabric frequently. There's a lot going on in the garment at this point, and it's very easy to accidentally sew an unwanted fold into the bodice. so just work slowly and keep adjusting as you go. After sewing, clip the neckline seam allowances inward along the curves to release some tension for when we turn the facing to the wrong side of the garment. Then, press the facing away from the bodice and collar in the same direction as the neckline seam allowances. A good way to keep from pressing unwanted folds into the garment is to spread the facing out to be as flat as possible while allowing the bodice and collar on the other side of the seam to be the more chaotic ones, as you won't be pressing anything off to that side of the seam. With the garment still spread open the same way as during our pressing, understitch the facing to the neckline seam by sewing 1/16 of an inch away from the seam through the facing and neckline seam allowances. Turn the facing to the wrong side of the garment so that it's up against the inside of the bodice. Pull the collar away in the opposite direction and thoroughly press the entire neckline seam from both sides, positioning the bodice and facing to be as flat as possible while doing so. Okay, so facing is in, collar is in, looking pretty good. This is my garment with the right side facing up, but let's go ahead and flip it over to wrong side up for the next step. We're going to be focusing on these sections of our facing that we didn't finish off with the binding. This portion of the facing on both sides is actually going to get integrated into the armhole binding. But in drafting this piece, I created it so that it doesn't include the 1/4 inch seam allowance of the armhole. This is in an effort to reduce some bulkiness that could happen if the facing went all the way to the armhole edge. So you're going to see that your facing looks a little bit smaller than the bodice along the armhole here, and this is okay. This is totally intentional. What we want to be doing is securing that edge of the facing to the armhole just along that section, but we don't want to be pulling the edges over to meet each other. We want to keep a 1/4 of an inch offset here. So I'm going to take my collar. We're just going to pop that collar. We're going to roll it upwards like this and try to get the facing and bodice sitting as flat and smooth as possible. Try to be sure that there isn't any excess folds or wrinkles underneath. We want everything smoothing outward evenly from the neckline to be sure that everything is sitting in the proper spot. There's my 1/4 inch offset. It actually looks pretty good. And I want to see that the shoulder seams are also aligned. I'll attach a few pins to hold the facing to the bodice in this position. The reason we want to secure the facing to this position is so that when we go and apply our binding to the armhole, it's sitting exactly where it's supposed to be. We don't want it shifting around. So we're just kind of securing it to this spot. Now, I'm going to leave the choice up to you here on how you'd like to proceed. You can either choose to just leave the pins and have that be enough for when you're attaching your binding later on, but I'm a big fan of hand basting. I find that everything sits a lot smoother and the pins don't get in my way as much. So I started with the pins just to help position things, but I'm gonna go ahead and do a basting stitch along these areas and then remove the pins. It'll be a lot easier to work with, in my opinion at least. So I have a needle already threaded and I'm just using hot fuchsia thread right here. It's going to be removed, so it doesn't really matter what color it is, but having good visibility of it will also help keep me from forgetting to remove it later on. I just want to come to the area that I have pinned, just that section of the armhole, and a little ways in from the edge of the facing, starting from down here, I'm just going to do a good old running stitch. And a running stitch is just over, under, over, under. So you can see how I even weave my needle through like 2 stitches at a time. And they can be pretty long, okay? So you'll see that this actually goes pretty quickly once you get the hang of it. And all of these stitches are about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch inward from the edge of the facing. Now that the basting is in, I can remove my pins. I had a knot at the beginning of the thread with a long tail, and up at this end, I don't even really have to knot it. It'll usually be fine if I just snip the thread with a couple inches remaining, and I'll repeat the same thing on the other side. And now my facing is nicely secured to the armholes, so it'll be all ready to go and much easier to manage when we apply our binding to the armholes a little bit later on. We're almost at that point, but we have to do one more step first, and that is we need to attach our side seams together. So let's go ahead and do that. This is a real easy one. We're just going to be bringing our bodice right sides together at the side seams. So I can sort of pick it up like this. Here's the front of the bodice, right side up. I just want to lay the backs so that they are right side down against the front. Here's one side seam and here's the other. So we're just going to go ahead and pin these and then they'll be all ready to sew. Pin beginning and honestly just one more in the middle is probably all I need. Side seams are all pinned and ready to go. Here's how they're going to go down. It's basically going to be the same process as our shoulder seams. We're going to sew them both with 1/2 inch seam allowance. After that 1/2 inch seam, we'll be overlocking both edges of the seam allowance separate from one another and then pressing those seam allowances open. Now that our side seams are completed, we can go ahead and finish off our armholes by attaching binding. Now this technique for binding is going to be a little different than the one we used to finish the edges of the facings. It's a different kind of finish overall, where we won't actually see binding visible on the outside of the garment. It will just be a single stitch line that almost looks as if you hemmed it. And this technique for the binding that we'll be using on the armholes will also be applied to the edge of our cutout section along the midriff, which runs between these two little points here. So to prepare our binding for both of these steps, we want to start by just measuring how much we need. If you're anything like me and have kind of a larger stash of binding that you're working off of, then you'll want to only kind of cut and prepare as much as you need for this particular process. So I want to start by just loosely walking it around my armhole measurement as well as the cutout measurement, and we'll cut our binding to that length. Let's just take the end and sort of loosely, casually walk it around the armhole. This is about one armhole's length right here. I can go ahead and just double that. So now I know this is the amount I'll need for 2 armholes. And from this point where my measurement is leaving off, I'll walk it along the cutout. And then to be safe, from that point, give yourself a few extra inches, 6 inches or so. Then you can cut your binding to that measurement. To prepare our binding for sewing onto the armhole, we want to take it to the iron and just gently press it completely open. It's okay if we still see some impressions from the folds because we're going to be returning it to that folded position, but I do want to just open it up and flatten it out a little bit to make it easier to work with in this next step. Then, after you've pressed it completely open, you want to take your scissors and trim away one of the side portions of the bias binding. I'm going to cut where I see the original fold right over here. Next, we're going to be sewing our binding onto the armhole. We want to be placing the binding on the right side of the garment. So notice how my bodice has right side facing up. And as we sew, we'll be matching the edge of the binding that we just cut to the edge of the armhole seam allowance. While we're sewing, our stitch placement will be to be sewing in this first fold, which should also be 1/4 of an inch from the edge of both the binding and the armhole seam allowance. One additional trick that we're going to do, because we're sewing a complete circle and we want to finish off the ends of this, is to take the binding and just fold 1/4 of an inch down towards you as you begin. And then we'll be matching this folded edge to the side seam of the bodice. The side seam is going to be our kind of beginning and end point for sewing the armholes. So once you have that end folded under and these edges are aligned, you'll simply be sewing right in this first fold all the way around until you overlap where you started by about 1/4 of an inch. Repeat this same technique for the cutout opening. Since it's not a complete circle, you won't have to fold the end of the binding over to start. Just leave a little bit extra at either end. Next, press the binding outward and away from the bodice, but in the same direction as the armhole seam allowance. Then, understitch the binding by edge stitching 1/16 of an inch away from the seam. Be sure to be following the same steps for the cutout as you are on the armholes. Yes, still more pressing with the binding. First, fold the binding down and around the edge of the bodice seam allowance, and then grab the entire binding and seam allowance and fold all of it to the wrong side of the garment, so that the final fold you're pressing in place is the first stitch line you used to initially attach the binding. The binding should no longer be visible from the right side of the garment. It should all be folded and pressed to the wrong side, fully enclosing the raw seam allowance as well. If your seam allowance seems too large to fit nicely within the original folds of the binding, then you could trim it down a bit to reduce the bulkiness. When you come to the portions of the armhole that include the facing, be sure that the facing edges are fully enclosed by the binding as you press. Finally, edge stitch 1/16 of an inch away from the final fold of the binding to fully close it up. Do this on both armholes as well as the cutout. So we're really coming along here, and I just wanted to take a minute to stop and assess what we just did with our binding. If you sewed your armhole binding and it still looks a little wrinkly or bunchy afterwards, just run over it again with the iron and it'll help smooth that all out nicely. We should see now that the armholes as well as the opening of the cutout at the bottom just have a single stitch line visible from the outside. And as we look to the inside, we should see all of our binding turned completely towards the inside of the garment at all these points. Also, check to see that the areas of your facing that go into the armhole are fully enclosed. You should see that the binding has now wrapped totally around them, and this is all sitting nice and clean. So at this point, we're ready to start on our waistband. One last thing though is down here towards the cutout, you may have a little bit of your binding that hung over. Just come along with your scissors and trim that excess away so that the bottom edges are clean and continuous. Just clip that off. And now we're ready to start applying our waistbands. For our waistband instruction, I'll be starting with Waistband B, which is the continuous waistband that does not have any hardware. And after this, I'll be following up with the instructions for Waistband A. To begin, we want to lay out all of our pieces and position them exactly as shown. We'll basically be assembling two separate waistbands. One will sort of be the outer waistband and the other will be the inner waistband. You should have one front waistband piece and two back waistbands that do not have interfacing, and one front waistband and two back waistbands that do have interfacing. The pieces with the interfacing will make up the outer waistband, and the pieces without the interfacing will make up the inner waistband. We'll begin by sewing the side seams, attaching the front to back waistband pieces for our two individual waistbands. So just take note of how I've laid out the pieces here, because these can be a little bit tricky due to their interesting curvature. My front waistband should be laid out like this so that the tailor tacks are towards the top. This is going to be the upper seam that gets attached to the garment, and this will be the lower edge. For the back waistbands, you want them positioned so that they're forming this sort of downward arc. But as you look at one of the individual pieces, it may be hard to tell the difference between which one of these is the side seam and which one is actually the end of the waistband that becomes the center back. So you'll want to look for the double notches that will be on one side of each back waistband piece. Here's my double notches. Those indicate the back end of the waistband, so they should be off to the far outer sides. Here are my double notches, and here are the sides without the double notches. And these are what will get sewn onto the front waistband. So I've also positioned the interfaced waistband the exact same way. This one is laid out with the right side of the fabric already facing up, which is what we want. Down here, I have the wrong side facing up with the interfacing on it. I just wanted to position it like this so we could see the difference between the two, but now I'll flip all of these pieces over so that the right side of the fabric is facing up. Once you have everything positioned like this, right side up, just take each of your back waistband pieces and flip them over on top of the front waistband. You'll be aligning these little seams, which are the side seams. And now we'll be pinning these side seams in place. After your side seams are pinned, you're simply going to sew all of them with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once the seam is sewn, just simply press the seam allowances open, and we don't need to finish off the raw edges on any of these because they're all going to be enclosed inside the waistband. Next, you're going to take the inner waistband, which is the one without the inner facing, and we want to mark our 1/2 inch seam allowance from the tailor tacks outward toward the ends. Just this section right here. And we want to be marking this 1/2 inch on the right side of the fabric so that we can see our marking as we press in the next step. Then, take your inner waistband to the iron and press the 1/2 inch seam allowance towards the wrong side. Only from the ends to the tailor tack, not the section in the center. Next, take both of your waistbands, your inner and outer, and place them with the right sides together. And now I'm going to be pinning the lower edge of the two waistbands together. This is the one that does not have the tailor tacks or the pressing. Pin the end points first. Then make sure that the side seams on both waistbands are matched and pin there. You should also have a center front notch on both, so match up the notches and pin. And then split up each remaining section with pins one more time. Once your waistband is pinned, you're now ready to sew this lower waistband seam, and you'll be sewing it at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once the lower waistband seam has been sewn, then you're going to open it up, press the seam allowances towards the inner waistband, which is the one without the inner facing, and understitch all the way along the lower waistband seam. Now, we're going to take our waistband and fold it so that we're bringing the right sides together, and we're just going to be pinning and sewing the center section. We want to be pinning and sewing just between our tailor tacks on either side. So I'll bring this over, and I want to be sure to really fine tune how I match up these tailor tacks as I pin. So I'm going to take a pin and stick it directly in the one I see on top, and then look underneath and try to get the pin to go into the other tailor tack below directly. Okay, so now I know I have both of my tailor tacks lined up, and I can weave the pin back up and through, and I'll know that they are nicely matched. Let's do the same thing on the other side. Next, we'll pin in the center where you should have notches on both. A couple more in between. And now we're ready to sew. We're going to sew this seam at 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we want our stitches to sit exactly between the two tailor tacks. You don't want to end up over sewing at all on either end, so be really precise about where you begin and end, as well as being sure that your back stitching doesn't go too far beyond either of the tailor tacks. After sewing, you can remove the tailor tacks and then turn the waistband tube right side out. Just a heads up, this is tedious. I've drastically edited out my struggle, so know that it's normal for this to take a while. Just keep pulling fabric from the inside of the tube. Then, use the iron to press the lower waistband seam with the understitching first, followed by the upper waistband seam, being sure to pinch and roll the stitch lines to the outer edges as much as possible. Press the center tube section only and save the outer sections of the waistband until after we've closed it up on the bodice. After your waistband has been pressed, we're pretty much ready to start attaching it onto the bodice, but first we have to make a couple little clips in our waistband that will allow us to do so. As I look at my waistband, I want to look for the outer waistband part, which is the one with the inner facing. On the outer waistband only, on both sides, we want to open this up to right where our seam ends, right where the tailor tack was before we removed it, and we're going to clip the seam allowance of that seam upward just to where that tailor tack was. So I just want to come in here, see how I fold everything back, and just make a clip of the seam allowance only right to where this upper waistband seam ends. And when you do it, it shall allow you to open up that seam allowance. See, now it's just coming straight up and out and it can sit flat, as opposed to the inner waistband where we pressed the 1/2 inch under. Do that to both sides. Now they're both open. Next, take the waistband and I'm going to turn it back like this. So this is right sides facing up of everything. Our bodice is right side facing up and the waistband is laid out so that the outer waistband, which is the interfaced one, is on top. Now I'll take it and flip it back onto the bodice. So it's like we're putting right sides together. I want to open up my waistband and only be pinning the outer waistband with the interfacing onto the bodice. I'll first pin at the very end of the waistband, which is the center back of the garment. Then I'll come up to my side seams. I want to be sure that the side seam of the waistband matches the side seam of the bodice. Then right here where we made the clip in our seam allowance a moment ago, this exact point should meet up with the finished edge of your binding on your cutout opening. So keep the seam allowance edges lined up as you continue, but then right here, see where the little corner is of the clip? That point should be exactly where the binding is passing. Match up those points and put a pin really close to that clip to hold it in place. Now we can go back to this other section of the waistband at the back here and add a few more pins. Now we're going to be sewing both of these sections of the waistband at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you want to be super precise with where your seam begins or ends at the point of the clip here. It should be coming right onto the binding and beginning right at that point. And you want it to be very securely backstitched there as well. This final step is being shown on waistband A, but it applies to both waistband styles. Go to the seam that's connecting the bodice to the outer waistband and press the seam allowance down toward the waistband. This will conclude the waistband B instruction. Now I'm going to be moving on to waistband A. I've laid out all of my pieces here on the table. We're going to begin by sewing kind of two separate waistbands. The one without the interfacing will become the inner waistband, and the one with the interfacing will become the outer waistband. We'll be sewing the side seams to attach the front and back waistbands together for each of the sections. I've already laid everything out exactly as you should to make sure that the correct pieces get matched up. So let's just kind of take a look at that here. These are my front waistbands, and they have an interesting little curve here. I've positioned them so that this upper edge is the seam that will get sewn onto the bodice, and the lower edge will be the lower finished edge of the garment. And I could identify these different edges based on the tailor tacks that are right here closer to the edge. There's a total of 5 tailor tacks on each of these pieces. You'll see that there's 4 that run right through the center of the waistband. These are for the snap placement. So what I'm identifying now is the one extra tailor tack on each that is closer to the edge of the fabric. This indicates that upper seam line of the waistband, so have those placed at the top when you lay out your pieces. For the back waistband, you'll see that it's this kind of little arc shape. The way we can determine which is the correct part that we want to sew is by looking for the double notches on one end of each back waistband piece. So as I look at this one, here are my double notches. The double notches indicate the center back, which is kind of like the end of the waistband where it meets the zipper. I want to have my back waistbands positioned so that those double notches are on the far outer ends of the pieces, and the unnotched ends of each back waistband is what will get sewn onto the front waistbands. So you want to lay your pieces out like this and have all of the fabric with the right side facing up. The waistband without the interfacing, I already have positioned with the right side facing up. For this one, I have it with the wrong side facing up so that you could all see the interfacing and identify it But now that we know what it needs to look like, I'm going to flip it over so that the right side is facing up. Now we can position our pieces to sew the side seams of the waistbands, which are here and here. So I'll come to each part of the waistband, take the back waistband piece, and just flip it over onto the front so that we're putting right sides together. And I want to line up this short little side seam. Next, we'll want to pin all of our side seams before we sew them. Once your side seams are all pinned, you're ready to sew them. We'll be sewing all 4 of these individual seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance. After they're sewn, you'll want to take each of them and press the seam allowances open. We don't have to do any finishing stitch like overlock or zigzag on any of these edges because they'll end up completely enclosed inside the waistband. Next, take your inner waistbands, the ones without the interfacing, and on the right side of the fabric, we want to mark our 1/2 inch seam allowance from these tailor tacks that are close to the edge, not the center ones for the snaps, from those tailor tacks moving outward towards the center back ends of the waistband. After marking the 1/2 inch, we're going to take these over to the iron and press that 1/2 inch toward the wrong side of the waistband. You're going to only be pressing the section that we marked, and you'll be turning it towards the wrong side and pressing exactly on the line, just from the center back up to the tailor tack where our mark ends. Now, you want to take the set of waistbands that have the interfacing. So this is the outer waistband. Set the inner waistband aside for a minute. We're just going to be pinning the outer waistband onto the bodice. I have everything laid out now with the right sides facing up. Let me set one waistband aside, and to pin this first half, we'll be pinning from the center back up to the point that our cutout begins. So I'll take my bodice, because I want this to be right sides together, and just flip it back in this direction. Now, as I look underneath at the waistband, I want you to re-identify this tailor tack that we discussed earlier. This is meant to indicate the point at which our bias binding needs to pass the stitch line. But I'm going to begin by pinning the corners at the center back. Next, I'm going to move across and find the side seam of both the waistband and the bodice, match them, and pin. And now over here, we want to place one more pin right where our tailor tack is. I want to keep the lower edges of the seams matched up, but as I see that binding curve upward, I want the edge of it to pass exactly through the tailor tack, just like this. And we want to place a pin at that exact point. Let's just go back to this larger section along the back of the waistband and add a few more pins. Let's go ahead and pin the other half the same way. Once you have these 2 sections pinned, you're ready to sew. We're going to sew both of these halves of the waistband with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Our seam will begin at the center back, and as we come to the tailor tack that our binding is matched to, we want our seam line to end exactly there and be secured by a nice solid back stitch. Next, you want to grab your inner waistbands, which are the ones without interfacing, and take the waistbands you've already sewn onto the bodice and fold them downward. You can even take that seam allowance and kind of flip it upwards toward the bodice so that the waistband sits flat, like so. Now we're going to be taking each half of our inner waistband and putting it right sides together against its corresponding outer waistband. So make sure that the shapes are the same and you have each one on its correct side. When I put them right sides together, they should be identical overall. So we'll take this one, flip it up, right sides together. We're going to be pinning each half of the waistband from the whole bottom edge, wrapping all the way around the sort of belt tip right here and across the top up to the tailor tack where the binding enters the waistband. Let's begin. I'll fold this half out of the way, and I want to always begin by pinning my sort of checkpoints, as I call them. So I'll start with the corner at the center back, match and pin the side seams of both waistbands. And then you never want to take your pins and just work them all the way down, because we may get to the belt tip and things won't match up. So we'll jump way up there, force all of these points to match, and let's kind of pin these two outer corners and the tip in the center. Now we'll come back to this section on the bottom, and we'll put our next pin right in the middle of this section. Then we'll do middle and middle. It may feel like I'm kind of jumping around with the pinning, but basically you always want to be pinning anything that must match up first. So anything that's a seam or a point or a notch, you pin those parts first, and then you throw down your other pins in the sections in between them. So now we'll kind of jump back here to this section on the back waistband, add a couple more pins there. Now we have the whole lower edge of the waistband coming around the tip of the belt pinned, and we just have to now do this upper portion up to our tailor tack. But let's go ahead and get the spot where our tailor tack is pinned first. So I want to look underneath and see exactly where the tailor tacks are at this point between the outer and inner waistband. You could even stick your pin directly into both tailor tacks to make sure they match up, like this, and weave it through. Now just a couple more pins along the top of the waistband. And this is now sufficiently pinned. But notice that I'm not pinning this section here where we pressed the seam allowance under on our inner waistband. This whole portion will happen later, so be sure you're keeping this part open, both in pinning as well as when we sew. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and pin the other half of the waistband the same way. Now that we have our waistband very thoroughly pinned, we're going to be sewing the entire portion that we pinned at 1/2 inch seam allowance. I want to begin my sewing at the center back, come all the way across the bottom of the waistband, pivot around the corners of the belt tip, continue up in this direction, still at 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you want your seam to end exactly at the tailor tack where the bias binding enters the waistband. So have your back stitch end exactly at that point. Next, come to the back waistband sections that are not sewn closed, open them up, and press the lower waistband seam allowance towards the inner non-interfaced waistband. Then understitch this portion of the waistband by edge stitching next to the fold through the seam allowances. You obviously won't be able to get all the way into the waistband where it becomes more of a closed tube. Just get as far as you reasonably can. At the short ends of the belt tips, trim the seam allowances down by 1/2 and clip across the corners almost to the stitch line. Then, turn the ends of the belt right side out, using a point turner to push out the corners. Don't worry if turning the belt out feels like a nightmare. I struggled with this plenty too, and this section was edited heavily. After the belts are turned out, gently adjust your tailor tacks if you need to by pulling them out of the waistband seams without removing them fully from the points that they're marking. Then, press the belt portions of the waistband, being sure to pinch and roll the stitch lines to the outer edges as much as possible. Press the loose belt sections only and save the outer sections of the waistband until after we've closed it up on the bodice. This next part will apply to both waistband styles A and B. Go to the seam that's connecting the bodice to the outer waistband and press the seam allowances down toward the waistband. This concludes part 2 of our sewing tutorial, but we'll be finishing up in the part 3 video. See you there!